Welcome everyone to this Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Here today we have a number of distinguished panelists, and the introductions for the panel are going to be done by Diana Heredia, who is a 50-year graduate student at the University of Texas in Austin, working on the globalization of indigenous commodities in the early modern period, particularly cochineal and other dyes. And she'll be also moderating the talk, or excuse me, the discussion. And she'll set the rules. I think the rules are 10 minutes each one of the participants, and then we'll open up these for a discussion. There was a precipitating essay, well, not essay, it's a chapter, the introduction of the book, The Invention of Nature, excuse me, The Invention of Humboldt, and my chapter on Humboldt and Columbus. That is the material that was available to everyone, although the panelists themselves had access to the whole book. Well, without further ado, I am Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra. I am the director of the Institute and the co-editor of the book that is part of this panel. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jorge, and welcome to our audience and also our lively online audience. It's a great honor to have you here, especially after last week in Austin was a little rough for many of us. So anyway, I'll proceed with the introductions. So Jorge already introduced himself, but I'll introduce our panelists, starting with Miruna Achim, who is an associate professor in the humanities at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Coajimalpa, in Mexico City. Her most recent publication was a co-edited collection with Susan Dean-Smith and Sandra Rosenthal, Museum Matters, the making and unmaking of Mexico's national collections, which was actually booked featured here at the Institute last year. And then with us too is Jimena Canales, who is an award-winning author and historian of science. Her books include Bedeviled, A Shadow History of Demons and Science, which was winner of the Cosmos Prize last year, and The Physicist and the Philosopher, Einstein, Bergson, and the Debate That Changed Our Understanding of Time, among many others. And she also has collaborated and published in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Art Forum, Nautilus, among many other scholarly journals. We should have also Dr. Kapil Raj, but I think he's having some trouble joining us, but I'll introduce him anyway.
Yes, please.
So hopefully he will join us. Kapil Raj is a lifetime research professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, France, and currently visiting professor at UNAM in Mexico City. His research focuses on the construction of scientific knowledge through intercultural encounter in the context of early modern and modern European South Asian empires. So his most recent, the most recent translation of his work is a French translation of Relocating Modern Science, Circulation and the Construction of Knowledge in South Asia and Europe. And finally, but definitely not least, is with us Professor Simon Schaffer, who was Professor of History of Science at the University of Cambridge until his retirement in 2022. And his most recently co-edited book is The Book of the Body Politic with the late Bruno Latour, and is currently a member of the Leverhulme Project in Making Climate History. And well, thank you to all of our panelists. As Jorge said, you'll have 10 minutes for your intervention. So we'll go in the order that you were presented.
Okay, so I will be
So
first.
I'll go first.
Oh, sorry. You go first. Sorry.
I'll introduce the book and share the screen. This is the Invention of Humboldt comes out of a provocation, which is The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolff. Yeah, and when I read this book, one of the things, the striking things about the book is that it won like 20 awards. It was published in 2015, 16. It's been translated into a great many languages, including Chinese and of course Spanish. And when I read the book, one of the things that caught my attention was the fact that even though Humboldt spent 5 years in Spanish America, he literally had one sentence on Humboldt in Lima and 5 sentences of Humboldt in Mexico, where he spent 1 year. He has an entire chapter on Jefferson and Humboldt in Philadelphia. And in order to describe slavery in Washington and Philadelphia, she uses Spanish America as a fold. Finally, has a chapter on Simón Bolívar in order to make an argument about how influential Humboldt was on the ideas of Bolívar. So literally, Humboldt appears as kind of not only the inventor of ecology and environmentalism and abolitionism, because he wrote on slavery in Cuba, but also he was kind of the intellectual inspiration of Spanish American independence, ultimately. So when I read these, I said, wow, I've seen these before. And I'm trying to move these. Let me see if I can erase these. Okay, yes, I've seen these before. I've seen it in Humboldt's time. This is a painting of Humboldt and Bonpland in the Orinoco from 1856. I think it's a couple of years before Humboldt died. He died of age 99 or 100. He was a very, he had a great longevity. And here you have Venezuela. Venezuela appears essentially a background, a landscape to instruments and the genius of Humboldt and Bonpland. There are no individuals except the savage in the background in a hut with a hammock, kind of having a good time. Venezuela, Cumaná, or the region that he visited, the Orinoco, excuse me, that is the object of this painting, appears as butterflies and lots of plants and probably dangerous mosquitoes. That is the way it appears Spanish America in Wolff. What is striking about the Wolff's book is that it was translated into Spanish, and it's been one of the best sellers in Spanish America of the adventures of Humboldt in the New World, without very little critical acknowledgement of the lack of colonial history, intellectual colonial history to the adventures of Humboldt in that translation. People just read it and think it's a beautiful, amazing book. So for me and for Mark Thurner, who is my co-editor, the question was an issue of memorialization. What is led to this type of reception of Humboldt, and Humboldt himself, who created this image of a land without much in the way of intellectual traditions to speak of. Why the intellectual traditions that he found in the New World disappear from, in general, memorializations of his adventures in the New World? And that reminded me of the other history of Ecuador with which I grew up, which is the La Condamine expedition in Ecuador, that has this huge monument in the middle of the world. It's called the Monument of the Mitad del Mundo, half of the world, latitude 0, that has the measurement of latitude 0 surrounded by the expedition of Lamartine and all French expeditionaries. There is no mention in the museum at all of the second expedition or the parallel expedition organized by the Spanish monarchy of Ulloa and Jorge Juan. The Spanish monarchy knew about these epistemological absence of the Spanish monarchy traditions of knowledge, and to every expedition in the Enlightenment that was sent to the New World, French or otherwise, they had a parallel expedition join the main expedition in order not to allow for these silences or the silencing of the local traditions of knowledge. And yet in Ecuador, that parallel expedition is absent from the museum, which is in and of itself surprising. And right next to the expedition, there is other type of museums, the Museum to the Indigenous Knowledge. In between indigenous knowledge of how to measure latitude and French knowledge, the colonial world is disappeared completely. There is no memorialization of that so-called colonial world. It's disappeared from local Ecuadorian memory in general. So school kids who go to the museum have no awareness whatsoever of these 300 years of the history of knowledge in these societies, of their ancestors, their own ancestors. Why these traditions have disappeared? And it had to do with the way the history of science in general is being written. This is a map of 1803 by Alexander von Humboldt of the profile of the Chimborazo. He's known for this profile. One of the great contributions of the Invention of Humboldt, the book that Mark Thurner and I co-edited, is the fact that many of the contributors have made these silencing, this process of forgetting and silencing in memorialization explicit and obvious, as in the case of the chapter by Alberto Gomez on Caldas. Alberto Gomez in that chapter contrasts this profile of Chimborazo in 1803 with this that led to this great publication of the Geography of Plants of Humboldt, for which he's best known, of 1807, with this map of 1802 by José de Caldas, a local naturalist in Popayan, in the region of northern Ecuador, that in 1802 had created a much detailed profile of Imbabura before they had met, Humboldt and Caldas, that led to the creation of a parallel tradition of biogeography. We're talking about 22 maps by Caldas that are still in a museum, Museum of Defense in Spain, that were published by Mauricio Nieto in Colombia, a decade ago. But until then, they were unknown. The work of Caldas that was parallel to Humboldt never acknowledged, even though they cohabitated together for 6 months in an hacienda in Ecuador. They share ideas. They naturalized. They went around the landscape, collecting plants, etc. And yet Humboldt never acknowledged many of his publications the influence of Caldas, which is striking because there is a translation of the Geography of Plants that appeared in Colombia prior to the publication of the Geography of Plants in France, with extended commentary by Caldas. It's a critique of Humboldt's Geography of Plants by Caldas, an annotated edition, translation in Spanish of the Geography of Plants that Humboldt knew. And yet in his entire life, Humboldt never cited Caldas, never acknowledged the existence of Caldas as one of the co-creators of biogeography and the very system of representation of communities of plants with height of mountains. Why was this ignored? Why did Humboldt forgot to cite the guy and forgot to even acknowledge the existence of Caldas, even though they lived together for 6 months in Quito. And this is a much better representation of Humboldt in the wilderness, unlike the one in the Orinoco, which is he's surrounded by Bonpland and Humboldt. They're surrounded by Caldas in an urban setting. This is a recent painting by a Popayanese artist of what really happened with Humboldt. He was in an urban setting. He spent most of his time not in the countryside, not in the wilderness. He spent most of his time surrounded by local intellectual communities in archives and getting information from local scholars, like this painting seeks to represent. Another chapter in the book by Jose Carlos Amaya explores in great detail the archaeology of silencing, how this process of ignoring, of silencing incitation, while at the same time acknowledging that they got support, local support, the art of silencing while acknowledging is the study of the edition of plants equinoxiales by Bonpland and Humboldt of 1808, which is a summary. Well, it's a treatise on new plants, allegedly new plants discovered by Bonpland and Humboldt in the trips to the tropics, and it begins with a dedication to Mutis, Jose Celestino Mutis. It has this beautiful painting of Mutis as a dedication, and yet throughout the book, Amaya studies, there isn't any recognition that Humboldt and Bonpland got an entire collection of plants, images from Mutis, and descriptions of plants, and yet they pass all this knowledge as if it was original, as if they had discovered all these plants, as if they had actually drawn all these plants, when in fact they were simply the guys who received a gift by Mutis of a few 120 plants and images of plants of a collection of 10,000 of them. This is one of 10,000 images drawn by the Mutis expedition of Nueva Granada by the many painters. There are 10,000 of these, and they are folio images, and they have yet to be all published. We are in volume 51, I think, that began in 1950, and yet we are not done yet with the publication. And this is the type of images that Humboldt received. Here they are. Amaya studies them, and this is what Bonpland and Humboldt argue was their own study of plants in the New World. They completely silenced Mutis, even though they acknowledged the guy in the preface with a beautiful dedication and even an image of Mutis. Then there are other examples. This is the case of Humboldt's map of the Magdalena of 1801. This is a map that he gave to the vice king of Nueva Granada, viceroy. And this is a map produced by Talledo, a Spanish engineer from Valencia, who spent 16 years in Colombia. And as soon as Humboldt learned about this map, was very critical of all the measurements of Humboldt. Here you have the critique of Talledo right next to the map of all the mistakes that Humboldt had made. Humboldt made a point of dismissing Talledo in a publication of 1821 as an ignorant Spanish engineer. My contribution to the book is a study of Humboldt's work on the history of geography. It's a 5-volume treatise. It's essentially a study of the 5 voyages of Columbus and 3 voyages of Amerigo Vespucci. That is essentially what this treatise is about, in which, as I argue in the essay, is essentially a form of self-fashioning in which Columbus appears as a Humboldt avant la lettre. Columbus is Humboldt and Humboldt is Columbus. And that representation of himself had a lot of purchasing power. It is still presented that way. It was picked up by Andrea Wolff in her Invention of Nature and the Adventures of Humboldt. Humboldt as a discoverer of nature, as a Columbus of our times. And yet, one of the things that is striking about the treatise is that it's completely reliant on the archive of Munoz and Fernandez and Navarrete. These are treatises that were published, the first one in 1790, which is the first volume of a planned history of the New World by the founder of the Archive of the Indies. The Archive of the Indies was created by Munoz. It's one of the largest colonial archives. And by this guy, who was the founder of the Museo Naval of Spain, in which you have the collections of all the hundreds of expeditions of the 15th century and 16th century. The 2 points, the many points, among the many points that I try to make in that essay of the book is essentially that Humboldt completely ignores the labors of these two individuals that made the papers of Columbus available. And by ignoring them, he ignores the system of knowledge that allowed these expeditions to be created in the first place. Why it was so difficult to have all this paperwork compiled? Why it took Navarrete 30 years and Munoz 30 years to compile this massive archive? One would imagine that the archive, all the paperwork of Columbus is available in a few volumes in the archives of the monarchy, but no. The reason why it was so difficult to compile all these paperwork of the different expeditions is because the process of governance in the New World that led to a private communication between petitioners and the monarchy, and that system of communication that is not printed, that is not public sphere, but is private and secret, led to huge decentralization, massive production of paperwork, but huge decentralization of this paper. And so these are typical documents of Columbus's petitions to the crown, etc., that are in there, and the litigation, because all the documentation of litigation with which Columbus engaged had to be found in these big queries that are the archives of the Indies or the archives of the monarchy. In the case of Navarrete, he registered like 10 different private and state archives in order just to gather the information on Columbus. So by ignoring the system of knowledge production in the New World, he's ignoring, that is Humboldt, he's ignoring the Hispanic world that allowed him to make these generalizations about Columbus. This is the Archive of the Indies. The Archive of the Indies has these panels, and in the panels, the wooden panels, you have these two spheres. One of the things that the monarchy the monarch as the monarch of two spheres, one of the things that Humboldt omits in his history of physics and the history of earth physics is the tradition of earth physics that he that was well established by the time he arrived in the Indies, namely the idea that the New World was a different sphere from Sacrobosco's sphere. And here you have the typical imagery of the medieval monarch, that it's a monarch over one sphere, that led in the Americas to the idea that the New World was a separate sphere from the old sphere. So here you have the sphere of the Americas, or the sphere of the New World, and the sphere of the old world, ruled by the Habsburgs. This tradition of two spheres, two physical spheres with two different types of physics, led to an iconography in the Spanish monarchy of two planets. The monarch ruled over two planets. Here are the studies of mathematics in Spain in the 18th century that are going to emphasize these two systems, physical systems, over which the monarchy ruled. So, to sum up, the essay tries to register two traditions of knowledge that were completely overlooked by Humboldt and that have made it very difficult for historians of science to acknowledge these local traditions, and that has allowed these individuals like Humboldt and individuals like Wolff to ignore these traditions of knowledge, and for the memorialization in our own countries, the lack of memorialization of these traditions in our countries, the fact that the 3 centuries of so-called colonial legacies are completely marginalized and ignored in these societies. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jorge. So we finally have our full panel here. Welcome, Dr. Raj, finally here. And so we're moving on with Miruna. Thank you.
Let me share my screen first. Okay, can everyone see it? I suppose you can. Okay, I will not make it small because I won't expand it, because when I do that, sometimes it does something weird and it kicks me out. So I will just keep it here. And we don't have time for me to get back. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. I would like to begin by bringing yet one more person to the table today. And that person that I'm bringing to the table today, because we are talking about giving credit to people who have been doing work. That person is Marie-Noëlle Boquet, who has written Le Monde dans un carnet, Alexandre von Humboldt on Italy, 1805, which has deeply inspired my own thinking about Humboldt and the approach myself and the co-author, who I wrote an article with for this book. That co-author is Gabriela Goldin-Markovich. So anyway, we have been very much inspired by Marie-Noëlle's Le Monde dans un carnet. As the title suggests, Bourget's book is not about Humboldt's travels in the Americas. It actually is about a small notebook that Humboldt produced on a short trip to Italy after he returned to Europe from the Americas in 1805. And yet this study has everything to do with Humboldt's American travels, because it's undertaken right after Humboldt settles down to narrate and to convert this mess of notes and materials and objects that he brings from the so-called New World. With this sort of urge, as Neil Saphir has written in his own essay for the book we're discussing today, this urge to record everything. So the whole point of this, part of the point of this book by Marie-Noëlle is to see how do you get that mess into Humboldtian science. What does it mean? And here I'll give you an example of that mess. That's Humboldt's writing on the Jorullo. It's another ascent. The book that we're discussing today presents various ascents, but the Jorullo is one of the volcanoes he climbed. Here we see the kind of palimpsests and the writing on top of each other that happens in his diaries. So inspired by Bourget's book, my co-author and I in the book, in the article we produce, ask about what it takes, what kind of work does it take? And that's also a question behind many of the others authors in the book. What kind of work does it take to ferry things from one place to another, geographically, materially, and conceptually? How does one carry mountaintops into knowledge that can be later compared with the Himalayas? How does one translate the Teide in Tenerife into information that would shape Humboldt's view of South American mountains? And I'm making references here to Juan Pimentel's and to Peter Mason's particular chapters. So how are things come to settle into European collections? How do journals become published books? How do others' writings become Humboldtian science? And here I invite you to I'm actually going to read a very short paragraph that Humboldt writes in his diary as he was traveling through Peru along the Huancabamba River in 1802, and he writes, "We had no less than 27 times to ford the Rio de Huancabamba, which falls into the Amazon. We were compelled to do this on account of the numerous sinuosities of the stream, whilst on the brow of a steep precipice near us, we had continuously within our sight the vestiges of the rectilinear Inca road. The little mountain stream, the Huancabamba, is no more than 120 to 150 feet broad. Yet so strong is the current that our heavily laden mules were in continual danger of being swept away by it. The mules carried our manuscripts, dried plants, all other objects, which we had been a whole year engaged in collecting. Therefore, every time we crossed the stream, we stood on the banks in a state of anxious suspense until the long train of beasts of burden, 18 or 20 in number, were fairly out of danger." So here let's reflect a little bit on the river's edge with Humboldt in fretful suspense. 27 times as each mule crossed the river. Let us reflect on what it means to lose a year's worth of collecting. And that collecting included botanical drawings, notes on the cinchona plant by Celestino Mutis, explanations of calendar and mythology of the Muiscas of Nueva Granada by Jose Domingo Duquesne, Jose Caldas's observations on plant geography, samples of rocks, descriptions and sketches of rivers, etc., etc. What does it mean, again, I ask, for the long line of beasts and their drivers to ferry across a world of knowledge, cautiously, one mule at a time, a fragment of the Andes at a time? So what that means to me is, and here are 3 areas of interest that I have in this brief intervention, means we need to look at the role of collectivities, which is something that Jorge has been stressing. We have on one side this figure of Humboldt always alone in nature or surrounded by one other scientist, and the so-called Amerindian savages behind, these people that are carrying his books. But it's not just the Amerindian savages that make up this collectivity. It's not only the people that are carrying his books, it's also the people that he met in many places. One of them is the University in Mexico City. He also met people at the School of Mines that he was, especially some of his old colleagues from Freiburg. And against this image of himself as a second Columbus, how do we put him back into this context with academies, scientists, indigenous peoples, publishers? And in particular, in the article that we write for the book, that Gabriela Goldin and I write for the book, we recreate a moment where Humboldt takes a manuscript, just like as Jorge was talking about the Caldas and the Mutis manuscripts, but so many others. And that manuscript is about Manuel del Rio, who's a miner at the School of Mines, a mineralogy professor rather. That manuscript is about his discovery of a new element, erythronium. But there's just so much disbelief and dismissal by the time this manuscript arrives in France, that it will take another 20 years for so-called erythronium, this new metal, to be reconstructed, reinvented, and would get another name. It would be called vanadium at that point and would be attributed to a Swedish person. That's just one example about the need to remember collectivity and remember all these traces of people that make up the production of knowledge. Another one I would like to refer to has to do with another point area of interest, has to do with so-called immutable mobiles. What is it that gets moved when Humboldt's objects, the Humboldts that he carries to Europe, are moved to Europe, and what doesn't? Because the whole idea, my suspicion is that a lot of things cannot move. One of the things that cannot move, that we also talk about a little bit in our particular chapter is cochineal. Cochineal is a red dye that's made from the crushed body of an insect that was used in Mesoamerica, and then in Spanish America. It became a monopoly of the Spanish king. And so a lot of people trying to find out its secret. Well, by the time, but even when you find out the secret of how to harvest cochineal rather, the dye doesn't happen. So by the time Humboldt arrives, he had free access to various manuscripts, including this one by José Antonio Alzate Ramirez, who produced it about 20 years before Humboldt's visit. And there we have an idea, we have a hint of why cochineal cannot travel easily. It doesn't travel because it is part of a system, a regimen of care and effect that does not travel. It's the indigenous people that need to pick up the insects, need to warm them up. They move them from the top of the mountain to the bottom when it's cold to avoid the frost. And Humboldt says in a world that's becoming capitalist, where capital, so money and time reign, this sort of intimate relation with substances like cochineal is not profitable, so it will not travel. So that's one example of a thing that will not travel. Other things do not travel directly because they're too big. And there, where we need to, so another instance of an immutable mobile that does not travel. So what we need to look at there is see what are the arrangements, the kind of ideological and literary technologies and material technologies that make it travel. So here is another example of, could have taken many other ones, but this is one of a set of ruins to the south of Mexico City in Xochicalco. And again, Humboldt is using somebody else's prints and description, but he strips it. He strips it of local legend, local lore. For instance, in the earlier one, we learned that the indigenous people, the Amerindians there were always talking about the ghosts underneath the ruins and the dangers of being at the ruin. Also, Alzate, who wrote about this, also is talking about the stones that are being repurposed for sugar cane mills. What does Humboldt do in his Vie de Cordillère? Well, he strips it of all that, of all the ethnographic interest, of all the debris, and he makes it float on a page like plants in a herbarium to make it commensurable with other objects, with other objects from the classical world, so to speak, from Greek and Egypt and Rome and well, anyway, and India sometimes. So what is, to sum up, to conclude rather, because I know I have 10 minutes, what makes me, what we found really interesting is that what is happening in this fairing of things and objects, this sort of cleaning up of things to make them legible and for comparison. It's cleaning up of people, it's cleaning up of other people who have made knowledge about them, it's cleaning up of other uses of these objects. And this is one of the movements, one of the major tendencies in museums in the 19th century. How do you juxtapose things that come from very different contexts next to each other, usually by cleaning up of previous use and previous names and all these palimpsests that we see in the journals, but we don't see in the finished product. But at the same time, now in the 21st century, there's a contrary motion to that. And in museums, at least, which is the field that I'm more familiar with. And that contrary motion is to create displays that account for the ways in which things have been used, produced, preserved, the ways in which they have mattered. So the book we're discussing today is part of that conversation. How do we put Humboldt back into that context? What political, social, ideological, ethical, commercial arrangements have made Humboldt into a disembodied symbol of science, making it unthinkable to imagine the production of knowledge in the Americas without making recourse to the figure of a lone hero, coming from elsewhere. So I would just like to ask to finish on that question, on the assemblages that have produced a figure, a disembodied image of science, like Humboldt in the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Achim. So now we have Jimena Canales. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi, thank you. Great. So I would like to talk a bit about what's generalizable from the story of Humboldt. I'm not an early modernist. I'm not a Hispanist. So I was obviously reading the book and comparing it with other scientists that I know better, and that would be with the goal of then trying to figure out if we need a completely new understanding of what science and knowledge is in the modern world. So I was thinking of the Einstein case. And as you all know, Einstein is very famous for in 1905 creating this special theory of relativity. And in 1919, he came to fame after the general theory of relativity was proven true after an expedition that took place in Brazil and Africa, led by the astronomer Arthur Eddington, that proved that the bending of light from the sun. So that is the regular way in which we understand Einstein's contribution is, he showed that light bent, and before him, light was considered to be straight, and it's the cornerstone of his genius, of his contribution, of the prediction. As an Einstein scholar, it's pretty easy to prove that years before he even started thinking about these issues, which was 1905, radio engineers around the turn of the century had already noticed that electromagnetic waves did not travel in straight lines. And this was thrilling for the radio engineers because you could actually send a signal and it wouldn't leave the atmosphere of the Earth. It wouldn't go straight. It would bend around the curvature of the Earth. The reason why it bends around the curvature of the Earth is not the same reason as why that we know from Einstein, that light is bent by gravity. There are many complicated reasons why it bends around the curvature of the Earth. It has to do with the crust being an insulator. But what was already very clear around 1900 was that electromagnetic waves did not travel in a straight line. So what do we make of that? It's one of the classic instances of how knowledge works. There's no scholars of Einstein have been astounded at his confidence at creating this model of prediction and then having this test be done in order to prove it. And Einstein himself always said, I know I'm right. I don't need the test. And in a letter to Max Planck is like, well, we needed this very expensive expedition in order to show the world, in order for other people to care. So there's an aspect of science that's always about taking others' knowledge and marketing in a better way, and showmanship has always been essential, from Faraday to. So was Humboldt any different, or is this how all scientific knowledge works? Is it always a process of a translation of repackaging, a process of communication, a process of bringing knowledge from one area to another. So let me say, something basic that we all know is that our contemporary situation changes the way that we write history, right? So there are these trends, and we change the type of history and the type of topics that we're interested in. And I have a phrase that to writing history involves changing history. And I could not have written a book about Einstein and Bergson that says that Bergson was not totally wrong if there weren't a general mood where one could reevaluate the power of the humanities, the power of the soft sciences versus the hard sciences, gendered aspects of those divisions, where the hard sciences are identified with masculine knowledge and the soft sciences, humanities and philosophy with femininity, right? So there are present conditions that allow us to look at different aspects and rescue different aspects of history. So my question then, is this just rescue history, or are we going to go, by finding out the sources of Humboldt, or again, are we coming up with a completely different view about what knowledge is in the modern world in relation to science? So there is the sociology of silencing particular views, particular people, and obviously the undeniable, boon of area studies, and a bit of the rise of Latin American studies in the U.S. In the Einstein case, nobody really cares about the radio engineers of the 1900s. So nobody's going to come to their rescue and say, hey, they thought about it first. And they did not think about it in the same way that Einstein did. They had discovered some essential aspects that Einstein then repackaged in a new way. So my question to Jorge and the authors is, how different are the Hispanic scholars that have been silenced in how they dealt with knowledge than Humboldt? So Caldas and Mutis and Talledo, are they less exploitative? Or are they just as exploitative? How did they deal with indigenous knowledge? What was their use of slavery? Is it really a case of the same wine in different casks? It's just a different language. Same processes for coming up with innovation, print, culture. Are criollos any more honorable in their citation practices? And do they give more credit to their helpers and to the people that came behind, before them? I don't know. Here we would have to look at the practices of citation and attribution of credit. Einstein's 1905 paper is well known for having given credit to almost nobody. It's a paper that had no footnotes. It's a rhetorical strategy that works for every genius. And as all of you know, the trends in history of science have turned away from the study of the lone hero or the genius. I remember one of the most wonderful conversations in my field was with Simon Schaffer, probably about 20 years ago. And at the time, the book, Deva Sobel's Longitude book, had just come out. And Simon was irate at the title. He pointed out the subtitle, "The Incredible Story of the Lone Genius Who Solved the Scientific Problem of His Era." Simon was very frustrated. We were frustrated in a pub in Cambridge, telling me, it's all wrong. There's no, all my work is about, there's no lone genius. There's no scientific problem of the era. But we love geniuses, despite, but the field, with Simon and other people, moved away from this focus on the individual. The trends are distributed cognition, and Bruno Latour is an important figure, as well as third wave feminists, Sandra Harding, the movement of situated knowledges, the focus on immutable mobiles from Latour that Miruna mentioned, the focus on inscriptions, which takes you to a very strange aspect of philosophy going back to Piaget. Is that, do we really want to change think about replace our view of cognition and thinking in the brain with little lines and inscriptions? Is that gonna do it? The focus on objects and museums, the bringing something from one place to the other, all in a sense are part of this a critique of genius, right? And then which has a long history, thinking of Edgar Silsel and the sociology of the construction of genius, and why certain historical epochs, like the 19th century, required the romantic hero, all the way to the Third Reich, where you had these political geniuses, and everybody seemed to be wanting a genius. But then, does that mean that we're throwing away the baby out of the water? And how far do we want to go, right? So we can, we drop the concept of the genius. We go to, we figure out the helpers. I'm thinking also the work of Hélène Mialet on Stephen Hawking's, the nurses, who helped him all the way, to the little lines, the inscriptions, where there's no individual, no person. It's a big, there's not, let alone, there's not a single brain, but there are no brains in that story. Can we really tell a history of science and knowledge that gives up the notion of thinking tied to a human brain, even if it's a collective brain? So that's a question I want to point out, and also one of the wonderful things about a project like this, that I believe goes way beyond the rescue history part of the story, in which we replace some Hispanic scientists for German Anglo, is that it actually highlights the value and the importance of translation. So the fact that Humboldt got all this knowledge and put it in a different language is actually really important for knowledge. If we look at knowledge as a process of hybridization, as a process of translation, and that leads us to a different way of thinking about innovation, where innovations requires a responsible sharing of knowledge, rather than a bringing something from nowhere, but it actually acknowledges that an essential part of knowledge is always about taking things from someone and bringing them somewhere else. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, or is it? And if it is, what other kind of knowledge are we replacing can we replace it with? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimena. So moving on, we're introducing, well, Professor Raj was not here for his introduction, but we thank him for joining us. Professor, you can unmute yourself.
Kapil, it's your turn.
Yes. Well, thanks a lot, Jorge, for inviting me to this panel discussion. Now, much of what I wanted to say has already been said by Jimena. So I'll have to reformulate things. But anyway, let me start from the very title of your work, which is, of course, I mean, it's a pastiche on of Andrea Wolf's blockbuster, The Invention of Nature. And in taking on the celebratory account of the lone genius, your book seeks to seriously complicate the Humboldt story, and it reminded me immediately of another such attempt. Jimena talked about Simon's frustration, but another colleague and friend of ours, Jim Bennett, actually did write a complexification of the story. And it was published 20 years ago in a book which you all already know, you've cited, and that's Instruments, Travel, and Science. And this, and it was all about how the story of John Harrison's invention of the chronometer was far more complicated than the lone hero story that Dava Sobel told in her own bestseller. Now, journalistic resuscitations and lionizations of scientific figures are greatly in vogue, and I'm unreservedly sympathetic to all attempts at providing correctives, whatever their degree of efficacy. However, one wonders as to whether scholarly publications are as efficient a means of countering journalistic writings constructed around the high drama of single-handed heroism, which is what they're all about. So let's get then to see where this stands in the history of science itself. And within the history of science, the critique of the lone genius narrative has been a major focus for almost a century, with Boris Hessen's groundbreaking intervention in the 1931 International Congress of the History of Science. And of course, I mean, Simon, as Jimena pointed out, has done a lot of work on this, especially with respect to Newton, but not only. And he can perhaps say a little more about this in his intervention. But I must say that I'm a bit surprised not to find any reference to this large corpus of work in the history of science to which your book unquestionably belongs. So it's a standalone case. There's absolutely no reference to any of this work. And that sort of surprises me a bit. But now to come to the book itself, one of its major objectives is to make visible and to rehabilitate Humboldt's multitudinous interlocutors and collaborators, but also the objects and local narratives and histories that he encountered during his American travels and which he erased or devalorized in his later writings. Now, this is a laudable exercise, especially in the light of the general unawareness of many European and North African historians of science when dealing with actors and materials from beyond Europe, especially Northwestern Europe, of the crucial inputs of indigenous interlocutors, often designated condescendingly, even now as mere informants, in the making of important parts of modern science. Indeed, the Jesuits in Asia and the Iberian empires of America and later in Africa, and likewise the Dutch, the British, and the French in their imperial encounters with the wider world, tended to airbrush or at least downplay the essential role of intercultural encounter and interaction which remains largely invisible through uncritical readings of their published writings. And this is true also of Humboldtiana. However, an increasing number of studies using various unpublished and other archival sources puts paid to the notion of that Europeans were the sole producers of knowledge, and that was subsequently diffused to the rest of the world. Cross-cultural interaction itself, it turns out, was a constitutive condition for the very possibility of sustained European presence in new and unfamiliar places, partly because of their small numbers, but more significantly because Europeans, as all strangers for that matter, no matter who and where they are, were epistemologically dependent on local populations in order to accede to the knowledges and practices of the cultures they initially interacted with and progressively colonized, thus making the latter indispensable intermediaries or go-betweens. In my own work, I have focused on a number of such Europeans whose trajectories, often fortuitous and self-fashioning, was strikingly similar to Humboldt's, as is so meticulously unearthed in this book of yours. Heinrich Adrian van Breda, the so-called author of the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, James Rennell, crowned as the father of British geography, Sir William Jones, the inventor of modern linguistics, to name but some, all deploy their extra-European experiences to fashion themselves to gain admission to the select world of metropolitan savants, using strategies so similar to those employed by Humboldt that this is more than mere coincidence. Indeed, their biographies provide an invaluable resource to study the role of European transcontinental and overseas empires in the co-construction of early modern Northwestern European metropolitan science and of these men of science who often came from the provinces and margins of the continent. It could even be said that the shortest path from the European provinces to the learned societies of their capitals passed through Calcutta or Beijing or Malabar, or, for you all, Spanish America. European empires thus appear as a sine qua non for the emergence and construction of forms of knowledge that constitute modern science. And imperial agents, such as Humboldt or Jones, in my case, are key figures in the process of fashioning science, in the process of their own self-fashioning. And one cannot, simply erase the self-fashioning and talk about the erasure of local knowledge and think that this is the whole story and ignore the processes of translation that Jimena just talked about, and which have actually been worked on. I mean, the whole idea of translation has been worked off in philosophical terms by Michel Serres, for instance, but also in sociology, both by Bruno Latour and especially by Michel Calon. And these are key figures in the history and philosophy and sociology of science. And they're not engaged with in this work. Also, non-European societies were not homogeneous, and focusing on interaction between them and European imperial agents helps shed light on their internal asymmetries and hierarchizations, as well as on the heterogeneity of knowledge forms and their bearers. Studying these interactions opens a window onto the complex historical relationships between these non-European state or imperial formations and the knowledges deployed in their administration. This aspect is one that I would have liked to have seen more of in the book. For instance, the knowledge hierarchies, which everyone sort of takes for granted while writing about, say, for instance, New Spain. the Creole imperial elites, but what is their relationship to the indigenous populations? And how are they in turn appropriating and erasing the knowledge of that exists? But you could also, take that down further into the various nations and the various, sort of state formations in pre-Columbian America. So, I mean, this is a bigger question, and I think Jimena has talked very well about this, and I don't have much more to say about it. But finally, the articulation between science and empire was increasingly recognized in the 1970s and 80s by scholars mainly in Asia, the Arab world, and also in France, leading to the emergence of science and empire studies, a subfield of the history of science that fast expanded to include scholars from the world over, a network which still strives today and focuses not least on the profound historical relationships between the state and empire on the one hand, and forms of knowledge that we recognize as important dimensions of science. Inter-imperial connections, circulations, cooperation, and rivalry are particularly important and topical aspects of this nexus. The institutional and administrative systems of the Iberian empires, the first modern empires, controlled large populations and immense territories, and devised original systems of practical and theoretical knowledge in fields as diverse as botany, medicine, mineralogy, mining, mapping, navigation, urban planning, etc., which were later imitated by the great colonial empires of the late 19th century. Humboldt played a key role in this process, and one can only hope that the authors and editors of your study will extend their coverage from the standalone geopolitics of Humboldtian knowledge to contribute to and engage with this growing corpus. Thanks.
Thanks.
And finally, our last discussant, Professor Schaffer. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks a million for the invite, which is extremely generous, and the opportunity to read the collection, which was very welcome and enjoyable and told me a lot, because, as others have already had the opportunity perhaps to admit, and I have better reason than them to admit, I'm no expert. Not only that, but I'm speaking last. And as Shakespeare beautifully shows us in Julius Caesar, if you want to bury someone rather than praise them, the problem is always acute when you speak last. That's what we're going to call, in this intervention, the Mark Antony problem. The Mark Antony problem is that everyone has already said exactly what you were going to say. And secondly, that what you want to say is precisely the opposite, rhetorically, of what you've been charged with saying. So that's quite a hard ask, but I'll do my best in the 9 minutes that remain. First point. Jimena's already said this, and then Kapil said it. So I'll say it too. It might well be that silencing and forgetting are an intrinsic politico-epistemic feature of the sciences, right? That a certain form of effacement and what we might call the epistemology of amnesia is actually constitutive of the sciences. There are many authorities and sources that certainly suggest that. T.S. Kuhn's work is a very good example. This would then explain something that Jorge in particular has taught us so much and so well about, which is the bizarre necessity that seems to be felt, especially in North America, to rediscover Humboldt. As in Rübke's magisterial metabiography of Humboldt, there have, if you only limit your attention to the German lands, been 23 works since 1800, some of which were by Humboldt himself, which announced that this, to use Wolff's subtitle, lost hero, had at last been discovered. Now, I suggest, this is the Mark Antony problem, that there might be a relationship between the work of discovery that Humboldt is taken to exemplify and the work of discovery that the historiography of Humboldt is taken to require. Since, as this collection under review shows us so well, the effect of Humboldt's intervention was to treat Latin America as entirely populated by objects and entirely devoid of erudition. I mean, that's one of the key lessons of this collection. And Jorge has just shown us beautifully how that most celebrated of all images of Humboldt and Bonpland does that job of work by evacuating Venezuela of any pre-Humboldtian erudition. Now, there must be a relation, that's my conjecture, between a work on Humboldt that announces that no one has ever discovered him before and that he's been lost, and therefore he needs resuscitation, and Humboldt's claim that that's what he was doing in South America. And I think one of the intriguing aspects of the historiography is what the relation between those two narratives might be, which takes me to my second point. It is, as the comrades used to say, no coincidence, I'm not original at all in saying this, that both of the developments that I've just characterized happen at exactly the same moment if we confine our attention to Central and Northern European natural history and historiography. That is to say, we're talking about what my late colleague Chris Bailey called the imperial meridian. It is exactly at that moment that this kind of discovering work in the sciences and this kind of genius-oriented historical rediscovery were invented. Until 1800, natural scientists could not be geniuses because they had invented nothing. After 1800, they become exemplary of the genius figure. And again, I do not think it's a coincidence that Humboldt provides a model for that relation. And I do not think it's a coincidence that what we might call the reification of Latin American space goes along with that change in what counted as history writing, at least in Northern Europe. And I think that's an area that we might want to look at. This then takes me to two complementary features of the arguments presented in this collection, which I would want to underline, at least for teaching purposes and for future work. One is the immensely important debates around the period 1800 to 1840 within the metropole, but as we learn from the book, not just within the metropole, about the comparative virtues of study and travel. Dorinda Outram, in her very important essay called On Being Perseus, which examines this fight in the case of Cuvier's review of Humboldt, describes it precisely as a contrast between what we might call the museological figure that Cuvier took himself to represent and the expeditionary figure that Cuvier took Humboldt to represent. We're in 1807. To quote from Dorinda Outram and Michael Dettelbach, who is with us. Hello, Mike, glad you're here. To quote from Mike and from Dorinda's quotation from Cuvier's review, this is the sentence that I think is really interesting for us. The great scenery of nature cannot be experienced with the same vivid intensity by the scholar as it can by those who witness it at first hand. But, and this is a very big but indeed, this is a Cuvier-sized but, okay? But if the sedentary naturalist does not see nature in action, he can yet survey all her products spread before him. The traveling observer can only travel one road. One can only roam freely through the universe by staying in your study, unquote. That's Cuvier. Now that argument is an imperial argument. It's an explicitly imperial argument. It's Bonapartist, it's about the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, it's about what centers of calculation are going to be, it's about a certain Napoleonic vision of study, accumulation, loot, juxtaposition, and classification. And it's organized by Cuvier so that this imaginary figure, Alexander von Humboldt, represents its antithesis. And it's all too easy. Wolff, I think, does this. Dettelbach never did this, to treat Humboldt as that Cuvierian caricature. One good way of correcting that is to remember, again, Jorge has been our guide in this regard, John Barrow's extraordinarily ferocious review of Helen Maria Williams' version of the researches in the Tory magazine, the Quarterly Review, in the summer of 1816, in which John Barrow, second Secretary of the Admiralty and chief science reviewer in London, denounces Humboldt because he has made it obvious that travel is unnecessary. This is what Barrow says. 2/3 of Mr. I cannot do the accent. What you have to hear here is a Tory, Scottish, vaguely South African twang accent, right? Otherwise you don't get the lip curling contempt of a Whitehall Mandarin for a Prussian, essentially Grub Street hack, which is what Barrow thinks Humboldt is, right? 2/3 of Mr. Humboldt's researches might just as well have been composed by someone who never crossed the border of Paris as by him who has traversed the Andes. Mr. Humboldt has unwittingly added to the number of those people who have shown that to write such researches, it is unnecessary to travel. So what Barrow finds, almost at the same time as Cuvier, in Humboldt's Recherche, in its English version, is the smell of the lamp. Humboldt cites too many sources He's read too much. He relies too much on theory and imagination. I'm not here to choose, thank goodness, between John Barrow and Georges Cuvier, neither of them terribly pleasant people at the best of times. But it's important to remember, it seems to me, that one of the most interesting conjunctural predicaments, which the new collection, I think, highlights in a very, very interesting way, is the force of that argument, the force of the argument between erudition and travel, right? I'd refer, for example, to Georg Simmel's magnificent essay on the stranger, just to illuminate what's at stake here. Simmel wrote this essay in order to try and understand precisely, this goes back to what Kapil and Jimena were talking about, to try and illuminate the notion of the trader who arrives and is here today and is really annoyingly here tomorrow. So a stranger who plays the stranger, who is massively implicated in locale, and whom, as Simmel puts it, is a potential wanderer. It seems to me that subject position in the imperial meridian addresses some very important features of what this collection is about. Last, and you'll be delighted to know, least. I don't think this is the most important feature of the book's aims and achievements, but I do want to emphasize how important I think it is, which is the relation between the historiography of Humboldt and the notion that the remote is the ancient, and how troublesome Humboldtian historiography was for that claim. Again, the chronological conjuncture is no coincidence. This is the moment, precisely 1798 to 1810, when figures notably like Degerando, writing in Paris for the Baudin expedition that Humboldt really wanted to join, argue that far away is long ago, that to travel from the metropole to the margin is to, Degerando says this explicitly, travel backwards in time, and that the folk whom you meet are essentially your civilizational ancestors. And there's a great deal of work in this collection that shows how difficult, challenging, and complex that claim was in the case of the New World. The clue is in the name. So, in particular, I was very struck in reading the collection by the various implications of these detailed glosses of the work of people, notably, I would say, Caldas. I mean, of course, notably Caldas, on this claim that those whom one was encountering were ancient. This doesn't do justice, the collection shows, to a rather fascinating claim that Humboldt and his interlocutors make, that no, in fact, in the Amazon, one was encountering, the phrase is very familiar to you, a vast shipwreck, precisely not an ancestral group, but a group who had degenerated from apparently Andean, Montagnard, high civilizations. Now, as Kapil knows and has taught us about in detail, this claim that those one encounters are degenerate formations of a much more sophisticated ancient civilization made trouble for the idea that far away is simply long ago. And that was going to be an extraordinarily important fight within the invention of imperial sciences. And I think this collection and a lot of previous work on Humboldt illuminates that in a very interesting way. I've said too much and at too great a length. Once again, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to read the book and to be made to think about it with you. And also because if I don't say it, someone else will, the immense privilege of being allowed to speak in English, when after all, this should entirely have taken place in Hochdeutsch and Castilian and Quechua and Nahuatl. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you, everyone. We are running out of time, but I noticed that there are a few of the co-authors in the audience, in the online audience. So I wonder whether they would like to say anything. Juan, Neil, it's around. I have no control over everyone here, but I see Juan and Neil were in the audience. You'd like to answer some of the critiques and questions, or add to the conversation?
Not really. I'm very pleased to be here with you and learning from all of you, but I had Zoom connections and especially in English, but I'm learning. Just I think anyway that about what Simon says, Humboldt represents both the traveler and also the far side traveler, no? The museum, the collection, the static traveler. No, he, as and in any other ways, he represents the both sides. No, he wants to be a complete scientific, a complete both traveler and a static scientist. But
we have 3 questions.
Jorge?
Yes.
If I could just jump in quickly, because I'm going to have to go, just to say thank you to all of the commentators who I thought were fantastic in bringing out some of the challenges of a project like this. I think ironically, the reaction to a work that focuses on a single individual and his, overextended and over-enlarged presence also does, in some ways, equally a disservice by flattening out some of the ways that we can think about how complex all science is taking place. That is to say, the processes. I thought, the emphasis on translation, the emphasis on the practices of carrying out, of inscribing science that every single person, if not in Hochdeutsch, commented. I think that's really important to show that this is an ongoing project, and that bringing all of these different characters, but also different practices to light is extremely important. So thank you to all of you for those comments.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Jorge, now you need to do another edited volume.
Of course. We have Elena Serrano who wanted to ask a question. We have Lina also with a question, and Brent Frosson as well. So Elena.
Sorry, we are together, Elena and myself. Hi, Jorge. My name is Stefan. I am a historian of science from Colombia. And as a Colombian, I was wondering if we can think about further about this kind of asymmetry between historical actors, historical scientists of the past, and historians of science of the present. So, because as you know, as being from Colombia and being historian of science is a kind of ritual that you have to do something about Caldas, no? It's like if you want to be a historian of science in Colombia, you have to have written something about Caldas. Maybe like in Argentina, if you want to be an historian, you have to have written something about Perón or something like that. But from this perspective, from Latin America, and especially from Colombia, if you are, contrasting your book and the ideas of your book against Andreas Wolff, The Invention of Nature, of course, this is very provocative. But if you are contrasting your book against a local tradition, thinking about center and periphery and all this, and the relations of power and knowledge and so on and so forth, this is to some extent, and I'm going to be here a little bit provocative, this is business as usual. So if you may, enlighten us about what is so provocative if you are contrasting this book and the ideas containing this book to a local tradition in Latin America, thinking about how to write history of science in Latin America and, to overcome the center and periphery dilemma and all these ideas of, materiality and networks and community and the idea of knowledge production as a process of knowledge communication and so on and so forth. And this led me to the second question, which is about, I was completely agree with what, for example, Jimena said, and also Raj Kapil, and I just read a few months ago an article written by Raj Kapil about a book about the historiography of life science and medicine in Latin America, and I was completely agree with what Raj Kapil said in this introduction. But again, being an historian of science from Latin America, I was very, surprised, because he never mentioned the whole tradition from Latin America working on this situation. So, I mean, there is a problem of translation also, not only in the past, but in the present, and with the historians of science from Latin America. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lina?
Hi, everybody. I'll try to be quick because I know time is of the essence. Thank you so much for the book, for the panel. The comments are fantastic, and for the questions. And actually drawing on the Colombia question that Stefan posed, but this is more for the time period itself, because of course, Humboldt would have been aware of the fact of a Colombia being invented at the time of when he was kind of after his voyages, and with Francisco de Miranda, who at the time was himself also fashioning himself as a second Columbus. So it's this interesting parallel between the power of science and knowledge and the lone scientist, but then you also have this prócer, right, Francisco Miranda, who's inventing Colombia, and there is this kind of overlap between the two of them temporally. So I'm trying to think through, and I was wondering if there's any. And I think in a lot of the chapters, of course, deal with Bolivar and independence, but I'm kind of trying to think through, well, there were so many people that Humboldt came in contact with that were giving him this information. And it almost seems like, I just wonder, to what extent was it in the interest of these folks that were in Humboldt's network to have a kind of lone genius, both either in terms of the Humboldt himself or the Colombian invention that was coming out of Francisco de Miranda that was having this overlap.
Yeah, on that, it's clear there is you need a genius, lonesome Humboldt in order to have a Republican independent state that sees Spain as a foil. So you cannot have the Spanish monarchy in the background of memory. You have to obliterate it. You have to silence it. You have to erase it. And who else to do it better than Humboldt? Brent.
Thanks so much for this talk. And I was just curious, not knowing much about it, but part of the lauding of Humboldt today seems that he's associated as the originator of anthropogenic climate change, which I mean isn't true, because there are people before him who were positing that in the island Caribbean and Mauritius, and he's supposed to be critiquing the plantation system, the colonial plantation system, and linking that to these effects. But I'm just wondering if he was drawing on I assume that he was drawing on local critiques of plantation agriculture or observations about climate change, anthropogenic climate change in Venezuela or elsewhere.
Yes, there's a study by Greg, what's his last name?
Cushman.
Sorry, on that. He's an alumnus here of UT History Department on that precisely. Greg Cushman, in which he shows that's all these thing about the Humboldt and Lake Valencia and him as the pioneer of ecological thinking is bullshit. Anyone here has a question that is not online?
Andrew Wilkins has a question.
Andrew.
Hi, sorry, I don't have, can you guys hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have a working camera, so I have to apologize about that. But there was one question I wanted to ask, is unfortunately a bit broad for the end. But one of the things that really struck out to me, it was a sense I was getting from your whole piece, is that you were talking in the speech today about how this is in large part about memorializing people, about recognizing the work that's been done. But there is this undercurrent of there being an alternative epistemic program, not just that there were different things people were doing, not just they were envisioning really the relationship to knowledge generally. I don't think it's just natural scientific knowledge, but there was a different system of how that could be connected, kind of mediated through the Spanish Empire. And you use this one phrase, I think you say Rortian pragmatism to describe this. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more if you thought of this as perhaps the Spanish Empire offering an alternative to the model of, I guess we could broadly call it kind of positive, like proto-positivistic thinking of someone like Humboldt, and perhaps mediated by something like the Spanish Empire, all this local and native and indigenous knowledge could have been systemized in a different way.
Yeah, that comes from a section in my essay on how the empire worked through petitioning from the ground up, not from the top down, and the way justice and law worked was through Rortian pragmatism, because the magistrates could not. It was the issue of what is just was ultimately a decision taken by communities and councils of magistrates through vote, and so the truth was essentially what the majority thought it was the truth, and what the letrados and consensus of letrados decided was the truth. There was no other way of getting to the truth, because it was a faction. It was a factional society organized on factionalism and an epistemology of factions that encouraged lying and encourage exaggeration of the truth and so on and so forth. So it was structurally an empire built on the foundations of Rortian pragmatism to work. And that is one of the things that I try to develop in my essay, things that are completely absent in Humboldt's Columbus. But they are not absent in Navarrete's, and they are not absent in Muñoz's understanding of empire, because they come from that empire, which leads to a different, more early modern understanding of knowledge, in which you have a a system of epistemological pluralism, in which many people can speak and talk and create knowledge of different things, natural history, geography, and so on and so forth. That early modern knowledge comes to an end with the Bourbons and Bourbon reforms in the late second half of the 18th century, in which the Enlightenment takes over and knowledge comes from the top down, not from the bottom up. So that is a transition that is happening within the empire, and I think it's happening in general in empires, European empires, and I guess in other world empires, the Ottomans and Mughals and others. But I don't know about that. But in the case of the Spanish Empire, it's happening, it's been transformed, and so there are many other Humboldts around Humboldt that think like he does. In that case, in that what Jimena says and Raj says, it's true. I mean, it's not that Humboldt is the only one doing it. Many other people are doing it. But the silencing others, and I have the example, for instance, of Navarrete's compilation of how to get to how the return from the Philippines to Mexico happened through a junta, through a reflection of evidence collected by all these exiles in East Asia, all these stranded navigators that returned to Mexico, and it's through their collective translation of knowledge in East Asia that they get to work out the circuits of navigation from the Philippines to Japan, and from Japan to British Columbia or Alaska, and then down to Acapulco. It is through a process of translation that is very, very similar to that of Humboldt. But that happened in 1560 or 1555, when this junta was created by the Viceroy of Mexico. So yeah, it's a form of gathering information, gathering knowledge from others that is not unique to Humboldt. The problem with Humboldt and our compilation is that what I think it's unique about it is the fact that the locals, in this case, like the Americans, are the ones who most promoted this view of a lone genius working in isolation and gathering new knowledge, and the Columbus of the New World. The geopolitics of knowledge not only has to do with European imperialism, has to do with transitions from empires to nations that lead to the ignoring of colonial genealogies and lineages of knowledge, which is it's all the more paradoxical and ironic. But I think we're out of time now, and I really want to thank everyone, Simon, Raj, Jimena, Miruna. Thank you very much for your participation, for your insights, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to see everybody.
Great to see you too.